All right, so I've gone in and I've sewn together quite a bit of this, leaving the little spikes or little scales on the top and the bottom, or the side, excuse me. The inside of the mouth, tongue, teeth, they're all left separately, and that'll be easy enough to paint because they're kind of separate elements anyway. So I'm going to right click on choose shell, and I'm going to grab all of these shells. And then I need to get them down into this quadrant here. And you can see it's a little bit outside the edges of this. So what I'll do is I'll hit R on the keyboard, get my scale tool, and I'll just bring that in just a little bit, and I'll put that like so. Now, I could have done something like this to optimize the size of this and then scaled it up that way, but that'd be kind of a nuisance. So I think we'll just leave it like so. And I just want to scale it to make sure I'm optimizing that upper quarter. Now I'm going to return to my object mode because I want to export this as a PSD network. And if I'm not in the object mode and I were to go to image, create PSD network, I would not see these windows available. All right, so you want to be very careful, make sure that you are in your object mode before you go to this point. So I've gone to inside the texture editor with my geometry selected and everything highlighted in that upper quarter. I'm going to go to image, create PSD network. Now this is where you determine the game size because the texture map will dictate the quality, but it will also increase the size of the file. So I'm going to leave the default 1024 by 1024. You'll notice that it has keep aspect ratio, and you never want to take that off because anything that Photoshop will see is this quarter in the upper right. Okay, so the first thing I do is direct this to my project folder into my source images. So I'm going to go ahead and put it in its appropriate spot, and I'm going to name it I'm going to save it, and then I'm going to click on the color tab in the attribute window, and then I'm going to move it over to the selected attributes. So everything else looks pretty good. All we have to do now is hit apply, and you'll notice that your geometry is no longer selected and the attributes are no longer available. That means you're successful in generating the Photoshop file for your texture. So now we're going to go into Photoshop, and in Photoshop we'll start to develop our texture and then preview it. All right, so we're in Photoshop, and I've opened up that PSD that I generated, and you'll see there's that checkerboard pattern. So one thing to kind of make note of in Photoshop is that when a generated Photoshop file comes in from Maya, there's a UV snapshot, which is the wireframe that you see vaguely here. You'll see it more clearly in a moment. And it also generates a folder. Now, anything that is going to be part of the texture of your model has to fall inside that group or folder. All right, so that's really important. If you, by accident, start to generate content above that, it will not preview when you reload or load your texture into Maya. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to eliminate that checkerboard pattern because it's no longer really necessary. That was more or less for our use inside of Maya. In the context of this project anyway. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to blank that out with a color that I'm going to use to kind of generate a bit of a texture here. I'm going to start with the base color of red, and now it's pretty clear to see the UV texture we generated in Maya. So I'm going to develop this a little bit more, and then we'll go out and we'll preview it in Maya together. All right, so I've gone and put down a preliminary texture inside of Photoshop, and if I was to turn off that UV map, you can kind of, or the texture, you can see the UV map that's underneath. All right, so I'm going to do things. First of all, I'll turn off the UV map so it doesn't preview on my model. Then, very important, each time you make an edit in Photoshop and return to Maya, you need to save that change, otherwise Maya won't see it. So now I'm going to select my geometry inside of Maya, and I've gone to my color node. Okay, so I would have gone here to material attributes, and I would have followed the color tab, clicking on the black triangle and black box, And very important, always click on reload, because Maya may not see it if you render. You might see it in the preview window, but if you were to render out your animation, very often in the sequence, you may be rendering out, will not see the texture unless you reload, and you'll have blank frames. So now I'm going to return back. You'll notice there might be transparency in your model. In the context of Photoshop, what you'll need to do is, again, you'll address this little box with the triangle on the bottom now. And when I click on that, I can see that the transparency got confused by the alpha channels on my layer. So I'm simply going to right click and choose break connection. So you can see that's the workflow. You would just go back and forth. And you can see that was just quickly put down. It looks pretty good. And now I would go in and develop the rest of the content. And you'll see where we've separated out things like the mouth. Again, I broadly threw this in, so I'd have to go back and refine it a bit. But that's the basics.